"Get out before I call the police," the diner manager barked, slamming his hand on the counter as little Grace clutched her teddy bear trembling. Sophie, only 7, stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "We haven't eaten in 3 days. Why are you treating us like criminals?" The room fell silent, and in the back corner a man in a dark coat slowly stood. What happens next will shock you. What would you do in their place? Snow swept across Boston that night, swirling through the narrow streets and biting against exposed skin. The city glowed with holiday lights strung across storefronts and lampposts. Yet, for 3 small girls wandering the sidewalks, the brightness only made their hunger more visible. Sophie, the eldest, by a handful of minutes, led her sisters down the slushy pavement with her jaw clenched against the cold. Lila stayed close, her eyes darting to the shadows, and strangers who passed them by always wary. Grace, the smallest, clutched her threadbare teddy bear to her chest, whispering to it as if the worn toy could answer her fears. Their shoes were soaked through their coats, no match for the biting New England air. They had walked for hours with no clear destination, only the hope that somewhere someone might show them kindness. When they turned a corner and saw the warm glow of a diner's neon sign flickering above the door, their pace quickened. Inside, they could see people laughing over steaming plates, couples clinking mugs of coffee, families leaning across booths in easy conversation. The scent of fried fish and buttered rolls wafted out each time the door opened. Grace stopped in her tracks, her small stomach growling loudly. "It smells so good," she whispered wide-eyed. Sophie squeezed her hand and pulled her closer. "Let's just try," she said firmly, though she knew all too well how it might end. Lila's lips pressed into a thin line. What if they call the police like last time? The word alone made all 3 shudder. Police meant being separated, scattered into foster homes, never seeing one another again. Sophie swallowed the fear and forced a steadiness into her voice. "We'll stay together. I won't let them split us up." The bell above the diner door jingled as they stepped inside. The wave of warmth struck them first, sharp and almost painful against their frozen skin. For a brief, fleeting second, it felt like stepping into another world. Red leather booths lined the room. Waitresses carried trays stacked high with plates. The hiss of a coffee machine filled the air. Grace's eyes widened in awe, her fingers tightening around her bear. The 3 of them slid nervously into the booth closest to the door, their legs dangling without touching the floor. But the illusion didn't last. Conversations quieted. Forks hovered in midair. A ripple of whispers moved through the room as diners noticed the 3 girls in their torn coats and muddy shoes. Behind the counter, the manager set down a tray, his gaze narrowing as he took them in. Robert Hayes had worked in that diner for more than 2 decades, a man who prided himself on keeping order in his small corner of the city. Compassion tugged faintly at him, but habit and policy rose faster. He walked toward the booth, crouching to their level, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. "Are you girls waiting for someone?" he asked. Sophie lifted her chin, trying to make her voice sound steady. "No, sir. We're just hungry. Please." Robert looked around the room, catching the stares of his customers, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. He sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve unaccompanied minors. It's the policy." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her teddy bear tighter. Lila clenched her fists beneath the table, anger burning hot in her chest. Sophie tried again, her voice cracking. "We haven't eaten in 3 days. Couldn't we just have something small?" Robert's expression hardened, though his voice softened slightly. "If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." At that word, the triplets moved as one. They scrambled from the booth, hearts pounding with terror, and pushed through the door into the freezing night. The bell jingled again, this time sharp and hollow. Outside, the city felt colder than ever. They hurried down the street, breath puffing out in uneven clouds, their eyes darting back, as though flashing lights might appear at any moment. Sophie pulled them into an alley beside the diner, pressing them against the brick wall. Grace's cheeks glistened with tears. "Why doesn't anyone want us?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the night. Sophie pulled her close, though her own heart threatened to break. What the girls did not notice was the man who had risen quietly from a booth in the far corner. Daniel Whitmore had watched the entire scene unfold, the hopeful steps through the diner door, the hushed rejection, the panic as the word "police" sent them fleeing. He had dined alone, dressed simply in dark jeans and a wool coat. No trace of the vast fortune he commanded, or the empire he had built from nothing in California years before. Tonight, he had chosen this small Boston diner to escape the weight of boardrooms and headlines. But fate had placed something else in front of him, 3 shivering children mirrors of a boy he once had been. Daniel paid his bill quickly and stepped outside, the cold air slicing against his face. Snow crunched under his boots as he followed the trail of small footprints toward the alley. He stopped at the edge, watching the sisters huddled together. Their coats were thin, their shoes soaked, their faces drawn with hunger and fear. The sight reached into him with a sharpness he hadn't felt in years. For a moment he said nothing, remembering what it was like to be young and desperate to look at every stranger as a potential threat. He knew trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. So he kept his hands visible and his voice low, careful not to startle them. "Hey," he said softly, stepping forward. The girls turned eyes wide, Sophie immediately moving in front of her sisters like a shield. Daniel offered a small, steady smile. "Don't be afraid. I saw what happened inside. I want to help." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind curling through the alley. Grace's stomach growled again, and Sophie's eyes flickered uncertainly between her sisters and the stranger. Daniel's voice remained calm, almost pleading. "I know what it's like to be out here. I know what hunger feels like. Someone once helped me when I thought no one would. Let me do the same for you." The triplets exchanged one of their silent glances, the kind only siblings could share. Fear lingered in their eyes, but so did the faintest spark of hope. Daniel kept a careful distance as the 3 sisters stared at him, their small bodies tense against the icy brick wall. Sophie stood firm at the front, her thin shoulders squared, as if she could block out the cold and every threat in the world. Lila's dark eyes were narrowed with suspicion, scanning him the same way she had studied the diner before they entered. Grace clung to her bear, the fur matted, and worn her lips trembling as she pressed her face into it for courage. Daniel didn't move closer. He remembered what it felt like to flinch from every adult who approached, wondering if they were there to help or to take something away. "You don't have to run anymore," he said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I know you don't know me, but I've been where you are." Sophie's jaw tightened. "No, you haven't." Her voice was small but defiant. "You're warm, you've eaten, you don't look like us." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right, I don't look like it now. But when I was a boy, I was cold and hungry too. I slept on benches, hid in alleys, and prayed for someone to notice me." He let the words hang there, his gaze steady. The girls exchanged a quick glance, that unspoken conversation only siblings understood. Grace peeked up from her bear, her voice barely audible. "What happened?" Daniel crouched, slightly careful to keep space between them. "One night, someone decided to help me. She gave me food, a warm bed, and told me I could be more than the world had convinced me to believe. Because of her, I got a chance to change my life." The triplets were silent. Their eyes flickered with curiosity, but mistrust still wrapped around them like armor. Lila finally spoke, her tone sharper than her sister's. Why us? Why now? People walk past us all the time. Why would you stop? Daniel's answer was simple. Because I see myself in you, and because I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to do what was done for me, I wouldn't ignore it. The wind howled down the alley, rattling loose trash and numbing their fingers further. Grace shivered violently, pressing closer to Sophie. Daniel's voice softened. Come back inside with me, not alone this time. I'll sit with you and nobody will make you leave. Sophie's lips parted as though she wanted to believe him, but her fear clung stubbornly. If you're lying, they'll call the police. Daniel shook his head. If anyone tries, I'll be the one they answer to. And I give you my word you will not be separated. The girls turned inward, their foreheads nearly touching as they whispered urgently to one another. Lila's eyes kept darting back to him, testing every flicker of his expression for weakness. Grace sniffled her cheeks, flushed from the cold. At last, Sophie turned back to him, her chin raised. You promise. The word came out with the weight of every broken vow they had endured. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. I promise. They didn't move right away, but Sophie's grip on her sisters eased. Slowly, she stepped forward, still keeping herself between them and the stranger. Daniel straightened, giving them space as he gestured toward the diner's glowing windows. Together, they began to walk back through the snow, their small footprints trailing his longer strides. Grace stumbled once, and without thinking, Daniel extended his hand. She hesitated, then slipped her tiny fingers into his. The simple act pulled at something deep in him, a memory of his own childhood hand clutching desperately at kindness. When they reached the door, the bell jingled again, startling the few customers still inside. Heads turned whispers, rows and forks hovered midair as the sight sank in the well-dressed man who had been dining alone, now escorted the 3 ragged girls who had been cast out moments before. Robert Hayes nearly dropped the tray he carried when he saw them. He set it down abruptly and hurried over, adjusting his tie, his face pale with embarrassment. Sir, I already explained to the children. Daniel raised his hand gently, not confrontational, but commanding enough to halt Robert mid-sentence. We should speak privately, he said in a tone that left no room for refusal. The manager blinked, then nodded quickly. This way. Daniel turned to the girls. You can sit at that booth there. I'll be right back and you'll be able to see me the whole time. Sophie hesitated, searching his face for any hint of betrayal. Grace tugged at her sleeve. He'll come back. Lila didn't speak, but her watchful eyes followed him intently as the 3 slid into the booth. Daniel and Robert moved toward a quieter corner. The manager shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting. Look, I have rules. I can't just. Daniel cut in calmly but firmly. I understand rules. But what I saw tonight was 3 starving children begging for a meal. Do you know what their greatest fear is? Not hunger, not the cold. It's being separated. His words struck Robert like a weight, and his eyes flicked to the booth where the girls sat, pressed tightly together. Daniel leaned closer. I'm here now. I will pay for their food. I will take responsibility for them. All I need from you is to serve them with dignity. Robert swallowed hard, his resolve crumbling beneath the quiet authority in Daniel's voice. Of course. If you'll provide your ID, Daniel slid his wallet across the table. Robert glanced at the card and froze. His eyes widened. You're Daniel Whitmore. He had read the name in countless headlines, seen it printed beneath photographs of glass towers and global ventures. Now that face was before him, humble yet unshakable. Daniel inclined his head slightly. Yes, but I would appreciate your discretion. Robert returned the wallet with trembling hands. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. I'll take care of them. He hurried off toward the kitchen, already signaling to the staff. Daniel rose and returned to the booth where the girls sat waiting. Grace's eyes lit with relief when she saw him. Sophie relaxed, almost imperceptibly. Even Lila, though still guarded, leaned forward as though ready to listen. A waitress arrived, carrying bowls of steaming soup, slices of fresh bread, and glasses of juice. The aroma filled the air, and the girls' stomachs growled in unison. Daniel sat across from them, his voice gentle. "Go slowly. When you've been without food, your body needs time to adjust. Trust me, I learned the hard way." They looked at him curiously, their spoons pausing. Lila finally asked, "Is it true you were really like us?" Daniel nodded, breaking bread into smaller pieces for them. "Yes. I know what it means to be cold, hungry, and afraid. And I know how much it matters when someone notices you. That's why I couldn't walk away tonight." Sophie stared at him, her eyes searching for cracks in his sincerity. Grace, her mouth full of warm bread, whispered, "Thank you." Lila still studied him warily, but she said nothing more. As they ate, Daniel listened more than he spoke, asking gentle questions, letting the girls reveal pieces of themselves at their own pace. Their words were halting, at first fragments of fear and memory, but the warmth of the soup and the safety of his presence loosened them. For the first time in a long while, laughter slipped between them, small, uncertain, but real. Daniel leaned back, watching them, a quiet vow forming in his chest. He had been given a chance once, and it had changed everything. Tonight, fate had given him 3 chances at once, and he would not waste them. The city was quieter by the time Daniel guided the triplets toward his car. The snow had settled into a steady fall, blanketing Boston in white, softening the sounds of traffic and muffling the hum of neon signs. Sophie hesitated as he opened the back door of the sleek black sedan, her arm extended protectively in front of Lila and Grace. The interior looked too polished, too unfamiliar, as though stepping inside would erase the fragile courage she had managed to summon. Daniel crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "You'll all be together." "You have my word," he said softly. Something in the steadiness of his tone and the way he didn't push but simply waited made Sophie finally nod. She helped Grace climb in first, then followed with Lila close behind. The drive out of the city was long, the glowing lights of downtown giving way to quieter neighborhoods, and eventually to sprawling estates outside Cambridge. Grace fell asleep quickly, her teddy bear tucked beneath her chin, her small head resting against the window. Lila sat stiffly, her gaze fixed on the blur of trees and fences outside, every muscle still taut with suspicion. Sophie stayed awake as well, her eyes on Daniel in the driver's seat. She said nothing, but he could feel her studying him, measuring every move. He let the silence stretch, unwilling to fill it with empty reassurances. Instead, he glanced at them in the mirror now, and then his chest tightening at the sight of how small they looked against the wide leather seats. When they turned through tall wrought-iron gates, the headlights illuminated a house that seemed to rise from the snow like a storybook mansion. Warm lights glowed from the windows of the 3-story home, and fountains frozen in mid-spray lined the front garden. Sophie's breath caught, and even Lila's sharp eyes widened for a moment. "You live here?" she asked, disbelief laced in her voice. "I do," Daniel answered gently. "And now, for as long as you need, this is your home too." The front door opened before they even reached the steps. Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked with Daniel for over a decade, stood waiting, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her lined face softened with warmth. She looked at the 3 girls with an expression that was half shock, half instant concern. "Oh, the poor things," she murmured quickly, stepping aside to usher them in. The girls shuffled into the grand foyer, their muddy shoes leaving faint tracks on the marble floor. A crystal chandelier hung above them, and the space smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. To the girls, it felt more like a museum than a place someone could live. Grace rubbed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer size of it all, while Sophie's arm instinctively drew her sisters closer. Daniel touched Margaret's arm lightly. "Prepare one of the guest rooms, the pink one in the east wing, and maybe some warm clothes, something soft." Margaret nodded briskly, already moving toward the staircase. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." Upstairs, the pink guest room glowed softly from a lamp beside a canopy bed covered in satin sheets. It was larger than the entire apartment the girls once shared with their mother. Sophie helped Grace climb onto the mattress, while Lila ran her hand cautiously over the silk drapes, as if certain they weren't real. Margaret returned with fluffy pajamas, slightly oversized, but clean and warm. She filled a clawfoot tub with steaming water bubbles spilling over the sides. At first, Sophie tried to undress her sisters herself, unwilling to let anyone else care for them, but Margaret's gentle patience slowly eased her grip. The girls sank into the water with wide eyes, giggling at the foam, clinging to their skin, their laughter echoing through the tiled bathroom. Daniel lingered at the doorway, watching them rediscover the simple joy of warmth and soap. Something in his chest tightened as he remembered his own first bath after weeks on the streets, a small act of kindness that had felt like salvation. He closed the door softly, giving them privacy, and retreated to his study. The room was lined with shelves of books, maps, and awards, but Daniel's attention was fixed on his laptop. Years of building his company had given him access to networks and resources most could never imagine. With a few keystrokes, he began searching for any record of the girls' birth certificates, school enrollment, medical files. Their story weighed on him not just because of the hunger he had witnessed, but because of the fear in their eyes whenever the police were mentioned. They were running from something, and he needed to know what. By the time Margaret brought the girls back down, dressed in clean pajamas and smelling faintly of lavender, Daniel had found nothing beyond fragments. It was as though their lives had been deliberately hidden. He rose from his desk as the triplets padded into the room. Grace carried her bare, now freshly washed her hair damp and curling around her face. Sophie kept her sisters close, but her posture was less rigid exhaustion, softening her sharp edges. Lila scanned the room, eyes moving from the shelves to the fireplace before finally resting on him. Margaret set down a tray of sandwiches and warm milk. "Eat, little ones," she urged. The girls obeyed cautiously, at first nibbling at the food, then devouring it as hunger overpowered hesitation. Daniel sat nearby, not eating, simply watching them. Their small voices began to fill the silence, fragments of stories about their mother slipping out between bites, how she used to braid their hair in different styles every morning, how she sang them to sleep even when she was tired. Sophie's voice caught when she spoke of her mother's smile, and Daniel's chest tightened at the ache in it. When the food was gone and the yawns came faster, Margaret guided them back upstairs to bed. The triplets climbed into the wide mattress together, curling against one another instinctively. Sophie in the middle, her sisters pressed close at either side. Grace whispered to her bear, her eyelids already heavy. Lila fought sleep longer, her watchful eyes still on the door until finally even she drifted off. Sophie lay awake the longest, staring at the ceiling, one hand stretched out to touch both her sisters as though to anchor them in place. Daniel stood quietly in the doorway, watching them breathe in unison. The sight pulled at memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit, his own nights, huddled in fear, the desperation of clinging to the only family he had left. He made a silent vow, then not just to keep them fed and warm, but to keep them together no matter what it required. Back in his study, the firelight flickered across his face as he picked up his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Charles," he said when the line clicked. It's Daniel Whitmore. I need your services. 3 children. Their mother is gone, their stepfather. I don't trust the story. Find everything. Records neighbor's history. I want to know who these girls are and what they've been running from." He hung up, leaning back in his chair, staring into the flames. Upstairs, 3 small figures finally slept in safety. But Daniel knew safety was fragile, and shadows of the past had a way of reaching even into the brightest homes. The first week in Daniel's estate passed like a blur for the triplets. The warmth of regular meals and the rhythm of safe sleep slowly began to soften their rigid vigilance. Grace discovered the library and clutched picture books with the same devotion she had once given her bear. Lila, still cautious, lingered near windows and doorways, her eyes sharp and calculating as though she expected someone to storm the gates. Sophie carried herself like a guardian, even here watching her sisters before she allowed herself to explore the grand garden or the pink bedroom they all insisted on sharing. But safety did not erase the shadows that followed them. Daniel's investigator Charles was swift. By the end of the week, he sat across from Daniel in the study, a thick folder between them. Her name was Rachel Carter. Charles began. She died 2 months ago. Acute leukemia, 32 years old. Daniel's chest tightened at the sound of the name. He said nothing, only gestured for Charles to continue. The girls' birth certificates list no father. Rachel raised them alone until she married Thomas Weber 2 years ago. Neighbors describe him as volatile, especially after Rachel's death. Drinking fights possible abuse. They ran because they feared being separated, and frankly, they had reason. Daniel's hand curled slowly into a fist. He thought of the bruises neighbors mentioned, the way Sophie's body always tensed at the word police, the way Grace flinched from raised voices. The truth burned through him, not just anger at Weber, but grief at a woman who had carried the weight of 3 children alone, only to leave them in the hands of a man unworthy of them. That night, after the girls had been tucked into bed, Sophie padded softly into Daniel's study, clutching a small box with tape peeling at the corners. "We kept it hidden," she whispered, placing it on his desk. Inside were little treasures, ribbons, folded notes, and a woman's neat handwriting, a faded photograph. Daniel lifted the photo carefully, his breath catching. It showed Rachel on a park bench in a blue dress, her long hair loose in the summer breeze. Beside her sat a younger version of himself, smiling at her with an expression he hadn't worn in years. For a long moment he couldn't breathe. Memories unspooled sharp and unrelenting mornings at a small cafe where she worked while in college, the way she slipped him the best slice of pie, because she said he looked tired, the late nights they spent bent over his first business proposal. She had been his first love, the one who believed in him when all he had was ambition and an empty wallet. And then one day she vanished. No note, no explanation. He had searched, but she had disappeared without a trace. Now, here was the answer staring at him in the form of 3 children who carried her eyes. His hand shook as he set the photograph down. Sophie watched him carefully, her young face solemn. "You knew our mom?" she asked. He forced his voice steady. "Yes. A long time ago, she was extraordinary." Grace, who had crept in quietly with Lila behind her, whispered, "She never told us about you." Daniel nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I think she wanted to protect you, and maybe protect me too." The girls crowded closer, their eyes wide with curiosity, confusion, hope. Lila's voice was sharper, demanding. "Then why didn't you find us sooner?" Daniel met her gaze, unflinching. "Because I didn't know you existed. If I had nothing could have kept me away." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken grief. Sophie finally broke it, placing her small hand over his. "We believe you." The following day, Charles returned with more news. Rachel's mother, Sarah Carter, was alive, living in a senior home on the outskirts of the city. She had never met her granddaughters. For reasons still hidden, Rachel had cut her off completely years ago. Daniel drove the girls there, their hands clasped tightly in his as they entered the modest facility. When Sarah looked up from her chair and saw them, her face broke with disbelief. The triplets froze in the doorway, 3 echoes of her daughter at different ages. But when her gaze shifted to Daniel, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You," she whispered, voice trembling. He nodded, his own throat constricted. In that small room, filled with the scent of roses and old books, the past came crashing into the present. The woman who had once saved a desperate boy from the streets was now the grandmother of the children he had vowed to protect. It was no coincidence, no random twist of fate. The threads of their lives had been woven together long before this night, and the truth left them all trembling, bound by grief memory and the fragile hope of a family reborn. The ruling from the court brought an end to months of tension. When the judge's words confirmed that Daniel Whitmore would become the legal guardian of Sophie, Lila, and Grace, the 3 sisters clung to him with a desperation that melted into relief. It was not just a legal decision, it was a new beginning, a moment that turned fear into permanence. Sophie whispered, almost as though afraid the words might vanish into thin air, "We'll never be taken away again." Daniel pulled all 3 girls into his arms and said with quiet certainty, "Never. You're safe now. You're home." In the weeks that followed, the house settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost as if it had been waiting for them all along. Mornings were filled with the clatter of cereal bowls and Grace's giggles drifting through the halls. Afternoons found Lila on the library floor, sprawled out with astronomy books, her sharp mind expanding in ways no one had nurtured before. Sophie shadowed Margaret in the kitchen, watching how bread was kneaded or soup was seasoned, eager to learn skills that made her feel capable of caring for others. Evenings ended with all 3 crowded into the pink bedroom, whispering secrets and laughter until they drifted to sleep, their hands always reaching for one another in the dark. Sarah Carter had grown stronger since leaving the retirement home and moving into a small cottage Daniel built for her on the estate grounds. She spent hours with the girls sharing stories of Rachel, how she once staged puppet shows for the neighborhood children, how she saved coins to buy books instead of dresses, how her stubborn streak made her both infuriating and remarkable. For the triplets, these stories filled in the pieces of a mother they remembered only in fragments, giving them roots they had thought were lost. For Sarah, it was a second chance at motherhood, one she embraced with tenderness. Daniel, for his part, carried the weight of both memory and promise. At night, after the house had grown quiet, he would look at the photograph Sophie had placed in his hands, the image of a young Rachel beside his younger self. It stirred both grief and gratitude. Grief for what had been lost, but gratitude for what had been found, 3 lives entrusted to him, and a family he never imagined he would have. It was during one of those nights that the idea for the foundation was born. Daniel knew wealth could build skyscrapers and companies, but it was powerless if it did not heal wounds like the ones Sophie, Lila, and Grace had carried. Standing in the very place where his life had been changed, he announced the creation of the Rachel Carter Foundation. Its mission was direct, to provide shelter, education, and protection for children facing hunger, neglect, or the threat of separation. No child, Daniel declared, his voice steady, but filled with emotion, should feel invisible. No siblings should fear being torn apart. We will make sure of that. The triplets stood beside him as he spoke, their small hands gripping his. Sophie looked out at the crowd, her posture already protective of her sisters. Lila, ever the skeptic, scanned the faces of strangers but held her chin high, her confidence growing. Grace simply leaned into Daniel's side eyes, bright, as if she believed every word would change the world. The audience, moved by the sincerity of the moment, rose to their feet in applause. As the foundation began its work, its impact spread quickly. Homes were opened for children with no safe place to go. Scholarships provided for those whose potential had been buried under hardship. At each event, Daniel brought the girls with him not as tokens, but as proof of resilience. "We know what it feels like to be hungry," Lila once said in her clear, unwavering voice. "And we know what it feels like when someone doesn't give up on you." Her words reached deeper than polished speeches ever could. At home, the life they built together deepened with ordinary joys. Pancake Sundays became a ritual, with Sophie insisting on flipping the first one, even if it came out lopsided. Sarah read bedtime stories in the soft lamplight, her voice trembling sometimes with memory, but steady with love. Grace filled the garden with drawings, taped to sticks fluttering like little flags of hope. Daniel tucked them into bed each night, listening as their whispered prayers grew less about fear and more about gratitude. One summer evening, as twilight painted the sky, Daniel stood by the garden, watching the three sisters chase each other among the roses Sarah had planted. Their laughter carried on the warm air, blending with the sound of Sarah's rocking chair creaking softly on the porch. The weight of his past, the loneliness of his empire seemed to dissolve in that sound. He thought of the boy he had once been, cold, hungry, invisible, and of the woman who had offered him kindness when no one else had. That kindness had come full circle, carrying him into this moment where three little girls had transformed his life as much as he had transformed theirs. Legacies, Daniel realized, were not measured by wealth or monuments. They were measured by promises kept by lives restored by love given freely. Rachel's story had not ended with loss. It lived on in Sophie's determination, in Lila's fierce intellect, in Grace's boundless heart. And through them, through the foundation that bore her name, it would continue to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their own. As the stars emerged above the estate, Sophie ran up to him, her sisters close behind their cheeks, flushed from play. "Daddy," she said, slipping her hand into his, "we're happy." Daniel looked down at them, his heart full. "So am I," he whispered, knowing that everything he had once longed for had found him not in boardrooms or contracts, but here in the unbreakable bond of a family built by fate and sealed by love. On a freezing night in Boston, three little sisters, shivering with hunger, were thrown out of a diner, denied even a scrap of food. That moment of rejection could have been the end of their story. Instead, it became the beginning. When Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire who had once known hunger himself, chose to follow them, the lives of Sophie, Lila, and Grace shifted forever. What began as an act of kindness turned into a journey of protection, healing, and discovery, a path that revealed lost family ties, long-buried love, and the unbreakable strength of compassion. The triplets, once terrified of being separated, found safety not just in a house of marble and light, but in the heart of a man who kept his promises. Sarah, the grandmother they had never known, became a source of stories, warmth, and belonging. And through the Rachel Carter Foundation, their mother's memory was honored, ensuring that countless other children would never face the same fear and hunger alone. This story is not only about the unlikely bond between a billionaire and three homeless girls, it is about the power of one decision. A decision to notice the invisible. To act when it would be easier to walk away. To give when the world expects you to stay silent. Daniel's choice reminds us that legacies are not built by wealth or power, but by the lives we touch, the promises we keep, and the courage to love when it costs us something. In our lives today, we may not stand in Daniel's shoes, but we encounter people every day who carry unseen burdens. A kind word, an open hand, a willingness to listen. These small acts can be the turning points in someone else's story. We never know when our compassion may become the very thing that saves a life. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what lesson you take from it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to create more stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the extraordinary power of kindness.